Hello everyone! Today we're going to be learning to identify and use relative clauses in our writing. For this lesson you'll need a pen or a pencil and your exercise book or some paper. Pause the video now if you need to go and get anything. So over the last 2 weeks we've learned all about complex sentences. On your screen now are some of the important vocabulary we have focused on which will help us in today's lesson. Can you pause the video and remind yourself what they are and why they are important in a complex sentence? So hopefully you could explain each one of those words. Just as a reminder, a main clause is the part of the sentence that makes sense on its own and contains a subject and a verb. This can also be called a simple sentence. A subordinate clause is the part of the sentence that doesn't make sense on its own. It adds extra information to the main clause but needs to be attached to it for the sentence to make sense. A subordinate clause can follow a main clause or it can start a sentence. However, remember, if it starts a sentence, you must use a comma to separate the two clauses. A subject is what the sentence is about, and a verb is a doing or being word. How did you get on? I'm sure you did brilliantly. So a relative clause is a type of subordinate clause as it needs to be attached to the main clause and doesn't make sense on its own. It gives us extra information about the main clause as it is related to the subject within that sentence. A relative clause always starts with a relative pronoun. Do you know any? Pause the video and have a think. How did you get on? Here are a list of relative pronouns and relative adverbs that you could use to start your relative clause. So, how do we add a relative clause to our writing? We need to start with a main clause. On the screen you can see mine. The family were waiting for me at the train station. The subject in my main clause is the family and my verb is waiting. It's a complete sentence that makes sense on its own. So, now I have my main clause, I'm going to add a relative clause to give me some extra information about the family. I'm going to add the relative clause of who were very friendly. I need to put this relative clause after the subject, which is the family, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. On your screen you can see the main clause in red and the relative clause in blue. If I take the relative clause out, the main clause still makes sense alone. All I've done is added some extra information with my relative clause. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, how do I know which relative pronoun to use in my writing? Well, this is why it's really important to identify the subject in the sentence. You need to work out if your sentence is about a person or people or an object. If your sentence is about people, you need to use the relative pronouns who, whose or whom. For example, you can see my main clause, the family were waiting for me at the train station. I want to add some more information about the family, so I've added my relative clause who were very friendly. The complete sentence becomes the family who were very friendly were waiting for me at the train station. Notice that the relative clause comes directly after the subject I'm referring to. This is important, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. What happens if I put the relative clause at the end of this sentence? The family were waiting for me at the train station who were very friendly. It sounds like I'm talking about the train station being friendly. The relative pronouns which and that are used for objects. For example, you can see my main clause is I helped on the farm. I want to add some extra information about the farm, so I attached the relative clause which was full of chickens, sheep and horses. You can see there my relative pronoun is which. Okay, let's see how confident you feel about choosing the correct relative pronoun. Have a look at my sentences on the screen now. I've missed out the relative pronoun. Can you identify which relative pronoun I should use? In a second, I'd like you to pause the video, copy the sentences into your book and add in the missing relative pronoun. My tip for you is to look for the subject. What is that extra information about? Also, say the sentence out loud. Hopefully it sounds right. Okay, are you ready? I've also added a star challenge if you want to go further. Pause the video and off you go. Okay, how did you get on? Let's go through them together. Remember to tick them if you're right and correct them if you've made any marvellous mistakes. Sentence 1. Lucy is a very lazy girl who never tidies her room. The subject is Lucy, so I've used who. Sentence 2. I bought a new outfit, which was very comfortable. I'm talking about the outfit, so I use which. Sentence 3. My dog, who is called Rex, loves to go out for walks. The subject is the dog, so I use who. Sentence 4. I like the meals that my mum cooks. That is the relative pronoun. Hopefully, if you put any other relative pronoun, it didn't sound right. And lastly, Grandma, whose eyes are sensitive, has to wear dark glasses. You have to use whose because you're talking about her eyes, which is plural. Who wouldn't sound right there. Okay, and for those of you who had a go at the star challenge, on the screen I've coloured the main clause blue and the relative clause red, so you should be able to mark that. How did you get on? If you made a marvellous mistake, do you know where you went wrong now? Okay, so take a look at our hinge question. Now we've gone over relative clauses and identified different relative pronouns, you should be able to identify them in a sentence. So, have a look at this sentence. The table which is made of oak is now black with age. Can you identify which part of the sentence is the relative clause? To help you, look out for the main clause and look for the relative pronoun. Pause the video until you're ready to find the answer. How did you get on? The relative clause is be, which is made of oak. That's because the main clause is the table is now black with age, and that makes sense on its own. Which is made of oak is adding extra information but doesn't make sense on its own. Did you work out the relative pronoun? It is which. Okay, over to you now. On the screen there are 5 sentences. Can you copy them into your book and underline the relative clause? Remember to look out for the relative pronoun and try to identify the part of the sentence that's adding extra information to the main clause. Okay, ready? Pause the video and off you go. Well done everyone, I know you're doing great at this today. Let's mark it together. As always, remember to tick if you're right and make any corrections if you've made marvellous mistakes. Sentence number 1. That came to our town is the relative clause. Sentence number 2. Which was near to her house is the relative clause. Sentence number 3. Who lives in Australia is the relative clause. Sentence 4. Which was full of people is the relative clause. And lastly, on sentence 5, the relative clause is whose rabbit I am looking after. If I take any of those relative clauses out, the sentence still makes sense on its own. How did you do? Now, you may have noticed that in the sentences we've looked at so far, the relative clauses are sometimes in different parts of the sentence. Relative clauses can be added to the end of a sentence, or you can embed them in the middle of the main clause. What is important though is that the relative clause is next to the subject, the person or the object that you are talking about. Look on the screen for my example. You will notice that these positions of a relative clause change how we punctuate them. Let's look at that more closely now. If a relative clause is embedded within a main clause, there must be a pair of commas to separate the clauses. Therefore, if I take out the commas and the relative clause, I'm just left with the main clause, which is complete. In my example on your screen, I'm giving more information about the subject, George, So I have to put my relative clause after his name. George, comma, who kept getting headaches, comma, needed to wear glasses. We also use a comma before the relative clause if the information is not vital to the meaning. If it is vital, do not use a comma. Something you have to try and remember is that if you use the relative pronoun which at the end of your sentence, you must use a comma. For example, Leo went to the park, comma, which was nearly built. So if you're using the relative pronoun which at the end of your sentence, you must have one comma before it. Okay, so now we've discussed the use of commas in relative clauses, let's have a go at this next activity. On your screen now, there are 5 sentences complete with relative clauses. I would like you to copy the sentences into your book, adding a comma or a pair of commas if they are needed. Remember, you need a pair of commas when the relative clause is embedded in the main clause or before the pronoun which. If you need a reminder, go back to the slide before. Okay, pause the video when you're ready and have a go. Okay, well done everybody, you're working really hard. Let's go through the sentences and you can correct them or mark them right if they're correct. Sentence number 1 needs to have one comma before the word which. Sentence number 2 has an embedded relative clause, so you need a pair of commas. My brother, comma, who is 4 years younger than me, comma, loves playing football. Remember, if I take out the relative clause and the pair of commas, I'm left with a main clause that makes sense on its own. Sentence 3 is very similar. I have an embedded relative clause, so I need a pair of commas. Lucy, comma, whose car had broken down, comma, couldn't get to work. Sentence 4 again is very similar. I have an embedded relative clause, so I need a pair of commas. Usain Bolt, comma, who is originally from Jamaica, comma, has won lots of gold medals. And then lastly, question 5 is very similar to question 1. I need to have one comma before the word which. My auntie lives in Manchester, which is in northwest England. How did you do? Hopefully you're feeling really confident about relative clauses now, so it's time to be imaginative. On the screen, I've written 5 main clauses and I've added an appropriate relative pronoun. Can you complete the relative clause to the end of these sentences? Are you ready? Pause the video, copy and complete the sentences and press play when you have finished. So this is a more difficult one to mark as you would have all written different relative clauses. However, it's important that you've identified the subject to add extra information to. An example for sentence 1 could be, Spain is a very hot country where many tourists go on holiday. Question 2, you might have done something like, J.K. Rowling is a famous author who wrote Harry Potter books. Sentence 3, my cat has sharp claws which dug into my arm. Number 4, I would like to buy some new trainers that fit better. Number 5, Faye is an amazing athlete who wins lots of medals. They are examples, you might have come up with different ones. Maybe there's someone at home you can check them with. What I do hope you've remembered though is that you've put your full stops at the end of your sentence. Okay, last activity everyone before we check our learning. On your screen there are a selection of main clauses and I have left space in the middle of the sentence for you to add an embedded relative clause. A few things that you need to think about before you start. What is the subject of the sentence? What relative pronoun is required? And what punctuation is needed if the relative clause is embedded? Remember to add that in. Okay, when you're ready, you can pause the video and copy and complete the sentences. Good luck! Well done everyone, you're working really hard. On your screen now, you should be able to see the relative pronoun in red that you've probably used and the pair of commas because every single sentence is an embedded relative clause. All of you will have come up with different clauses. but make sure that it is adding additional information to the subject, which you can see in bold. For example, for sentence 1, my friend moved to America last month, you might have added, my friend, comma, who lived next to me for 5 years, comma, moved to America last month, or my friend, comma, who is called Kerry, comma, moved to America last month. Maybe there's someone that you can check yours with. The most important thing is the relative pronoun and the pair of commas. How did you get on? Fantastic work, everyone. We've got to the end of our lesson. Hopefully you feel like you've mastered relative clauses and you feel confident to use them accurately in your writing. So let's check our learning before we go. On the screen now, I have written 5 sentences, all using relative clauses. Can you decide if I've used them correctly? And if I haven't, what marvellous mistakes have I made? If they are wrong, can you write them in your book correctly? Okay, when you're ready, pause the video and off you go. Okay, let's see how you've got on. Sentence 1 is incorrect. Although I've used the right relative pronoun who, and I've added extra information to the subject, my parents, I have only used 1 comma. Because it is an embedded relative clause, I need a pair of commas. So it should read, my parents, comma, who are very strict, comma, gave me a list of chores to do. Sentence number 2 is incorrect. This time I have remembered to use a pair of commas as it's embedded, but which is the wrong relative pronoun? Because my subject is a person, Theo, I need to use the pronoun who. So Theo, comma, who was 9 years old, comma, had a younger sister. Sentence 3 is also incorrect. Lots of people make this marvellous mistake. I don't need a pair of commas because the relative clause is at the end of the sentence. However, because I've used the relative pronoun which, I need to use a comma before this. So it should read, Mr. Evans was playing the piano, comma, which was located in the school hall. Sentence 4 is correct. My relative clause is embedded. I've used the correct pronoun and a pair of commas. My relative clause adds extra information to the subject, which is the grandmother. And lastly, sentence 5 is also incorrect. This is a tricky one. There is a relative clause, but it's not next to the subject, which in this case is the dog. Therefore, having the relative clause at the end of this sentence sounds like I'm saying the doorbell is scared of loud noises. It should read, my dog, comma, who was petrified of loud noises, comma, growled at the doorbell. How did you get on? I hope you're feeling really confident now about relative clauses and that I will see them in your writing very soon. Well done everyone, and see you again next week.